St. Augustine is the oldest port in the U.S., and so it's a wonderful place for an archaeologist to work. We've had ships coming and going to and from St. Augustine for 450 years. Because of our inlet, the way to get into St. Augustine from the ocean, it was always a very dangerous inlet. The St. Augustine Inlet was very shallow. It was very treacherous for ships because it changed a lot. So you would have a storm come through and the sand would move, and the sandbar that was in one place would shift over to another place. So it was very tricky in the days of historic sailing ships. The research arm of the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum is focused on discovering these great stories about our nation's oldest port. And we search out and find historic shipwrecks and other archaeological sites that are related to the maritime history of our region. And we are actually putting our boots on the ground, going out, getting dirty, getting in the mud, digging in the sand, being the first person to touch something that hasn't seen daylight in 450 years is kind of a neat experience, and that's what we do here. The shipwreck that we have named the Storm Wreck is probably one of the most exciting shipwrecks that we've ever discovered along the First Coast. It's one of the older ones. It wrecked in 1782, and it's very interesting because it was a refugee ship, a wartime refugee ship. And so this war, of course, in 1782 was the American Revolution. But towards the end of the American Revolution, a lot of these people who were loyal to King George knew the handwriting was on the wall. The war was going to end, and believe it or not, the most powerful empire in the world was going to lose this war. And so they began leaving. What we have with the Storm Wreck is a ship that was part of the evacuation fleet for the city of Charleston. And so all of the people in Charleston who wanted to get out of there were leaving on this fleet. The inlet in St. Augustine was so dangerous that 16 of those ships wrecked while trying to get into St. Augustine, which of course was the closest colonial port that was still loyal to King George. So it's very interesting, you know, the wide range of stuff that we are finding that really reflects what it was like to live in the 1700s, and really reflects what you would bring if you were forced to leave your home in an emergency, in a crisis. The very basic necessities that you would bring to keep your family alive and to try to keep your family feeling like life was going to be okay, even though it was a pretty tough time. When we first found the Storm shipwreck, of course, we weren't even sure if it was a shipwreck or not. We knew we had a magnetic target, and we sent divers down, and the divers probed beneath the sand, and lo and behold, they found some artifacts that were man-made. We laid out a grid system underwater. So we had PVC grids dividing our site up into 1 meter square units, and we dig 1 unit at a time. And we don't dig with a shovel or a trowel like folks dig on land. We use a dredge. So we have a handheld device. It's kind of a 4-inch hose, and you can basically suck up the sand with that. And so essentially what we're doing is again, 1 square meter at a time, we're kind of sucking the sand away and exposing the objects that remain under the sand. That's kind of what it's all about for archaeology, is to expose what's down there and to very carefully record everything. Then we bring it to the surface, and in our case, everything has been rusted over. Usually you can look at an object and it looks almost like a lump of rock. And so then we x-ray the object. Then in the laboratory, once we have seen an x-ray and we know what's inside, then we carefully clean the object and chip off centuries of incrustation, and that's when we expose the object to air for the first time, really. We have also had a military presence on this shipwreck. It's the first items we found that told us that there were soldiers on board were some of the buttons. So we found regimental buttons. So these are all parts of the British Army, units in the British Army that we know were in Charleston, and so on this same fleet that lost the ships here in St. Augustine. Probably the most exciting military artifacts we found were the muskets, and we found 3 muskets in one field season. But when we x-rayed them, that's when the archaeologists really got excited. 2 of our 3 muskets were loaded, and that's quite rare. Certainly on a shipwreck site, you wouldn't normally keep your musket loaded all the time. Your gunpowder would get damp from the sea air, that kind of thing. So that tells us that these guys were really worried about the safety on the ship, about rebel privateers that were out there trying to capture British ships, because of course the war was still raging, the war was still going on, even though we were close to the end of the war. There's really not all that many museums that have an active archaeology program where people can visit a museum and not just see things in cases, but see archaeologists bringing in artifacts that they found from their diving that day, or our archaeological conservators who are cleaning these objects that are crusted over with hundreds of years of growth from the sea. And so that's one of the things that is really special about the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum. And so it's a really great way for the archaeologists to kind of stay in touch with the people, and for folks who are interested in history and archaeology to get to talk with a professional archaeologist and to see the latest discoveries.